In the rotting archives of a Georgia county courthouse, buried beneath a century of neglect and water damage, lies a photograph that defies the laws of human biology. The image, dated 1914, depicts a black woman of indeterminate age standing in the hallway of a segregated infirmary, her eyes fixed on the lens with an expression of terrifying, ancient patience. Attached to this photograph is a medical file for a patient named Hannah, listing her estimated age at death as 132 years old. But it is not the number that chills the blood, it is the paper trail that corroborates it. Property tax assessments from 1798, estate inventories from the Civil War, and census records from the early 20th century all track the same woman, describing the same distinctive scar, bound to the same family line for over 4 generations. This is not a story of longevity, but of a macabre mystery that science refuses to study and history tried to burn. Tonight, we open the file on the Georgia slave who watched every master die, revealing a case so sinister that the official records were deliberately destroyed to hide the truth. Before we descend into the archives to unearth this forgotten mystery, I need you to join our investigation. Subscribe to Before the Story right now and enable notifications, because the history books have omitted chapters that only we are willing to read. If you believe that the past holds secrets that demand to be heard, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, from what part of the world are you joining us to uncover this story tonight? I want to know how far the whispers of this American mystery have traveled. The discovery began in the sweltering summer of 1932, during the height of the Great Depression, when the Works Progress Administration commissioned a comprehensive reorganization of the Oglethorpe County Archives in rural Georgia. Ilara Vance, a meticulous young researcher assigned to the project, was tasked with cataloging what were termed liquidated assets. Boxes of documents from plantation families whose lineages had finally collapsed into poverty and obscurity. The basement of the courthouse was a stifling, windowless purgatory of humidity and dust, where the smell of decaying paper mingled with the metallic tang of rust, creating an atmosphere of oppressive stagnation. It was here, tucked behind a wall of water-damaged land deeds, that Vance discovered a box labeled simply Thurmond Estate, 1790-1918. The box had been taped shut, not with the standard archival adhesive, but with heavy wax seals that suggested it had been closed with the intention of never being reopened. Inside the container, Vance did not find the typical crop reports or tax ledgers that characterized the bureaucratic remains of the antebellum South. Instead, she found a disorganized collection of personal artifacts that spanned nearly a century and a half, yet seemed to center around a single, impossible subject. The first item to catch her attention was the grainy black and white photograph from 1914, clipped to a weathered manila folder. The woman in the image appeared small and frail, wrapped in a white headcloth, but her posture was unnervingly upright, her gaze piercing through the decades with a clarity that unsettled the researcher. The caption on the back of the photo, written in a shaky, elderly hand, read, "Hannah waiting for the end, God help us." The context of the discovery is crucial to understanding the horror that would unfold. Oglethorpe County in the 1930s was a place where the ghosts of the Confederacy still dictated the social order, and where the lines between folklore and history were often blurred by the red clay dust. However, Ilara Vance was a woman of science and letters, not given to superstition, and she initially categorized the file as a clerical error or a case of mistaken identity passed down through generations. But as she began to cross-reference the contents of the Thurmond box with the official county records, the discrepancies she expected to find were replaced by a terrifying consistency. The documents did not contradict each other, they built upon one another to form a timeline that should not have been physically possible. The records indicated that the Thurmond family, A dynasty of planters that had once owned thousands of acres had suffered a slow, agonizing decline that mirrored the rise of the woman named Hannah. It was a decline marked not by sudden tragedy, but by a strange, attrition-like withering of the male heirs, a sequence of deaths that seemed less like natural misfortunes and more like the inevitable balancing of a ledger. Vance sat on the cold concrete floor of the archives, the dim bulb flickering overhead, and began to arrange the documents chronologically, unaware that she was piecing together a moral indictment that the county had conspired to bury. The silence of the basement seemed to deepen as she read, the weight of the past pressing against the damp walls. The initial document in the timeline was a yellowed, crumbling bill of sale from Charleston, dated August 1790, listing the purchase of one Negro girl, name of Hannah, approximate age 8, sound of limb and mind. The purchaser was Silas Thurmond, the patriarch who established the family's Georgia foothold. There was nothing remarkable about the transaction itself, a mundane atrocity in an era defined by them, except for a peculiar obsession noted in Silas's private journal, which was also preserved in the box. Silas had written extensively about the child's eyes, describing them as too old for her face, and noting a stillness in her demeanor that unnerved the other enslaved workers. What made the discovery macabre was not the cruelty of the era, which was expected, but the specific recurring details that linked the child in 1790 to the woman in 1914. Throughout the pile of papers, references to a star-shaped keloid scar on the left collarbone appeared with forensic regularity, appearing in medical bills, plantation inventories, and identification papers spanning 124 years. Vance realized with a growing sense of dread that this was not a case of a name being passed down from mother to daughter to granddaughter. The physical descriptions, the mannerisms, and the specific scar remained constant, while the world around the subject changed, burned, and rebuilt itself. The atmosphere in the archives shifted from academic curiosity to a cold, creeping realization of the impossible. Vance was holding the documented proof of a life that had stretched beyond the boundaries of human endurance, a life lived in the shadow of 4 generations of masters who had believed they owned her. The documents suggested that while the Thurmonds believed they possessed Hannah, the dynamic had shifted imperceptibly over the decades until the captive became the witness and the witness became the executioner of their legacy. This was the dark secret that Oglethorpe County had hidden in a wax-sealed box, a story of a justice so slow and so absolute that it looked like immortality. As Vance delved deeper into the box, she found that the official history of the county had been sanitized to remove references to the Thurmond anomaly. Church registers had pages torn out. Census records contained redacted lines where Hannah's age should have been listed. It became clear that the community had known about her, had feared her, and had ultimately decided to erase her from the collective memory rather than confront the implications of her existence. The impossible mystery was not just that she lived, but that she watched, and that her watching seemed to carry a metaphysical weight that crumbled the foundations of the house she served. By the time Ilara Vance finished sorting the initial layer of documents, the sun had set outside, leaving the basement in a gloom that felt heavy with unseen presences. She understood that she was not merely looking at a genealogical curiosity, but at a case so terrifying that even the doctors wanted to forget. The woman in the photograph was not just a survivor. She was a living monument to the sins of the land, a figure who had stood still while history marched around her, waiting for the final debt to be paid. And the documents Vance was about to examine would prove that Hannah's payment was extracted not in money, but in time. The first crack in the facade of reality appeared in a document dated October 1842, a probate property assessment conducted upon the death of Silas Thurmond. By all logical metrics of the 19th century slave trade, An enslaved woman of 60 years, the age Hannah would have been based on the 1790 purchase, should have been listed with a depreciated value, considered a liability rather than an asset by the cold calculus of the time. However, the assessment, written in the cramped, hurried script of the county clerk, listed Hannah, house servant, with a valuation of $800, a sum typically reserved for prime field hands or skilled craftsmen in their youth. This financial paradox was the first irrefutable signal that something unnatural was occurring within the Thurmond household, a detail that defied the economic laws of the plantation system. Alongside the official assessment, Elara Vance found a private letter written by Silas Thurmond just weeks before his death, addressed to his son, Jebediah. In the letter, Silas's handwriting was erratic, the ink blotched as if the writer were trembling or writing in a state of fevered agitation. He instructed his son with a desperation that leaped off the page. "You must under no circumstances sell the woman Hannah. She keeps the count. She is bound to this land and to our blood, and I fear what might befall us should she be severed from this house." The phrase "keeps the count" was underlined 3 times, a cryptic warning that suggested Hannah's value was not in her labor, but in her presence. The anomaly deepened when Vance compared this valuation to a medical ledger from the same year, 1842. The plantation doctor, a man named Dr. Calloway, had visited the estate to treat an outbreak of dysentery. His notes, preserved in the Thurmond box, listed the ages and conditions of the enslaved population. Next to Hannah's name, he had hesitated, crossing out 60 and writing, "appears 30. Constitution remarkable. Pulse slower than natural." This medical observation, made by a man of science trained to observe the degradation of the human body, directly contradicted the chronological reality. It was the first piece of scientific evidence that Hannah was not aging at the pace of the world around her. This discrepancy between her chronological age and her physical presentation created a disturbing dissonance in the records. To the tax assessor, she was a high-value asset. To the master, she was a spiritual burden. To the doctor, she was a biological puzzle. The documents revealed that the Thurmond family was already beginning to view her not as a human being, but as an object of superstitious dread. Silas's death, recorded shortly after the letter was written, was described in the county death register as sudden cessation of the heart, but a diary entry from a neighbor described it differently, noting that Silas died screaming that the woman was counting his breaths. The financial records from 1843, following Silas's death, showed that his son Jebediah obeyed his father's terrifying instruction. While other assets were liquidated to cover estate debts, land sold, livestock auctioned, other families separated, Hannah remained fixed on the ledger, transferred to Jebediah with the same high valuation. The callous bureaucracy of the estate transfer treated her immortality as a matter of simple accounting, recording the transfer of the ageless wench as if it were a piece of durable furniture. This bureaucratic acceptance of the impossible highlighted the moral blindness of the era, where profit outweighed the laws of nature. Vance uncovered a subsequent inventory from 1850, nearly a decade later, where Hannah's value had risen again to $900. In a time when the market fluctuated wildly, the appreciation of an elderly enslaved woman was unheard of. The text of the inventory included a marginal note from the overseer: "Does not tire, does not speak. Matches the description of the girl bought by your father in '90, yet shows no grey. The hands are afraid of her." This document confirmed that the fear of Hannah was spreading beyond the master's house and into the quarters, creating an atmosphere of isolation around her. The records also contained a strange lack of expenditures for Hannah. While the plantation ledgers meticulously recorded the costs of food, clothing, and medical care for the other enslaved people, Hannah's name rarely appeared in the expense columns. She seemed to require nothing, consuming neither the master's resources nor his medicine. This absence of maintenance costs contributed to her mysterious value. She was an asset that existed outside the cycle of consumption and decay, a perpetual observer who required no fuel to continue her watch. By the late 1850s, the anomaly of Hannah's existence had begun to warp the social reality of the Thurmond plantation. A letter from Jebediah's wife to her sister in Savannah complained of a coldness in the house that no fire could dispel. Attributing it to the silent woman who stands in the corners, she wrote, "I look at her and I feel that I am the one fading while she remains permanent. She resembles a stone statue more than a servant, and I catch her looking at Jebediah with the eyes of a judge." This domestic testimony transformed the anomaly from a financial curiosity into a haunting presence that permeated the daily life of the oppressors. The first block of evidence concluded with a chilling realization. The Thurmonds were not keeping Hannah. Hannah was keeping them. The high valuation was not a reflection of her worth to them, but of the price they were paying for their own entrapment. She had become a fixture of the estate, a living record of their lineage that refused to die, and as the Civil War approached, the documents suggested that she was preparing to witness the next chapter of their destruction with the same terrifying patience she had shown the first. As the timeline crossed into the chaos of the Civil War, the paper trail surrounding Hannah grew darker and more fragmented, yet the picture it painted became increasingly undeniable. A battered plantation ledger from 1863, stained with soot and what appeared to be dried blood, recorded the desperate final years of the Thurmond estate as the Confederacy collapsed. The entries detailed the severe rationing of food, the seizure of livestock by passing armies, and the spread of disease. Yet amidst the lists of dwindling cornmeal and pork, Hannah's name appeared with a checkmark indicating she received her ration, followed by a note from the overseer, "Refused, says she does not hunger, gave share to the children." This refusal of sustenance during a time of starvation was corroborated by a letter found in the same collection, written by a Union soldier named Corporal Thomas Miller in 1864. Miller's regiment had requisitioned the Thurmond house for a command post during Sherman's march to the sea. In his letter home to his wife in Ohio, Miller described the eerie atmosphere of the captured plantation. He wrote of an ancient negress who sat on the front porch while the boys looted the silver and burned the barn. She did not weep or beg. She watched us with eyes like grey stones, neither afraid nor angry, merely counting the items as they left the house. Miller's letter contained a detail that sent a chill through Elara Vance's spine in 1932. He noted, "The locals say she has been here since the Revolution, that she is 100 years old if she is a day, yet she moves with the quiet strength of a shadow. When Captain Holloway tried to question her, she looked through him as if he were already a ghost." This external testimony from a Union soldier, an outsider with no reason to participate in the local folklore, validated the local rumors. To the invading army, she was a figure of mythical endurance, untouched by the violence that was consuming the world around her. The death of the second master, Jebediah Thurmond, in late 1864, provided the next critical piece of evidence. Jebediah did not die in battle, nor did he succumb to the violence of the invasion. According to the family Bible, which recorded births and deaths, he died of a wasting sickness that confined him to his bed for months. However, a private journal entry from the plantation's frantic mistress described the scene of his death with horrifying specificity. "He withers daily," she wrote, "shrinking into his own skin, while she stands at the foot of the bed, hands folded, watching. He begs me to make her leave, says she is drinking the air from the room, but she will not move and I am too afraid to touch her." This description of wasting while Hannah remained robust, inverted the power dynamic of the master-slave relationship. The documents suggested a parasitic reversal, where the oppressor's vitality was drained by the mere presence of the oppressed. Jebediah's death certificate, signed by a weary county doctor amidst the collapse of the local government, listed the cause simply as exhaustion. But the margin contained a scribbled query. Why does the servant present with such vitality while the master perishes of no known injury? It was a medical impossibility that the doctor noted, but could not explain. Following the war, the Emancipation Proclamation technically freed Hannah, yet the 1866 labor contracts, sharecropping agreements that replaced slavery with debt peonage, showed that she remained on the land. Unlike the other formerly enslaved people who fled the Thurmond estate in search of families and freedom, Hannah signed her mark on a contract with Elias Thurmond, the third master and Jebediah's son. The contract was unusual. It stipulated no wages, only room and board in the main house. It was an agreement not of labor, but of residence. She was staying to finish her watch. A diary from a visiting cousin in 1867 observed the strange hierarchy in the post-war Thurmond household. Cousin Elias is the master of the house in name only, the entry read. He moves quietly, terrified of the old woman who haunts the hallways. She wears a white head wrap now, always clean, though they have no money for soap. She serves the food, and they eat in silence, eyes downcast, as if she were the grandmother and they the children. This social inversion marked the accumulation of the anomaly. Hannah had transcended her status through sheer longevity and the weight of her memory. The accumulation of evidence also included a series of unexplained accidents involving those who attempted to remove her. A scrawled police report from 1868 mentioned a vagrant who tried to force Hannah from the porch, only to suffer a seizure of the limbs and fall down the stairs, breaking his neck. The report noted, the woman did not raise a hand. The man seemed struck by a sudden palsy when he looked upon her face. These incidents reinforced the local superstition that Hannah was protected by forces that defied explanation, a macabre mystery that the law could not police. By the end of the 1860s, the paper trail had established a terrifying pattern. The Thurmond men were dying young, their bloodlines thinning, their fortunes evaporating, while Hannah remained a constant, unchanging fixed point. The documents from this era were brittle and stained, but the story they told was clear. The Civil War had freed the slaves, but it had not freed the Thurmonds from Hannah. She was the shackle they had forged, and now she was locked around their necks, waiting for the final heir to fall. Sitting in the dim light of the 1932 archives, Ilara Vance found herself struggling to maintain the objective distance of a historian. The rational part of her mind, trained in the empiricism of the 20th century, sought a logical explanation for the timeline she was constructing. Her initial hypothesis, scribbled in the margins of her notepad, was one of mistaken identity or multi-generational deception. The name Hannah must be a dynastic title, she theorized, passed from mother to daughter to maintain a position of privilege within the household. The longevity is a trick of record-keeping, a blurring of three separate women into one mythological figure. This dynasty hypothesis was a comforting rationalization, one that fit within the bounds of scientific possibility. It explained the consistency of the presence without accepting the impossibility of the biology. However, the archives held a document that would shatter this theory and force Vance to confront the supernatural reality of the case. It was a wrinkled, water-stained invoice from a Dr. Elias Thorne, a country physician, dated June 1888. The invoice billed the Thurmond estate for suturing of laceration on the neck of the servant Hannah, caused by falling glass. Attached to the invoice was Dr. Thorne's clinical examination note, which detailed the procedure. In his description of the patient, Thorne wrote with professional precision, "Patient is an elderly negress of indeterminate age. Skin is taut." Beside the new laceration on the left clavicle, there exists a singular, star-shaped keloid scar, old and white, clearly the result of a branding or deep trauma from childhood. This specific detail, the star-shaped keloid on the left clavicle, matched perfectly with the description in Silas Thurman's 1790 purchase journal, which had noted a star mark on the girl's neck. The probability of 3 generations of women bearing the exact same star-shaped scar in the exact same location was astronomically low. The scar was a biological fingerprint, a somatic marker that linked the 8-year-old girl of 1790 to the elderly negress of 1888. This undeniable physical evidence dismantled the mother-daughter theory. Unless the Thurmans were ritually scarring each generation of servants to maintain a ruse, an absurdity that made no sense given their fear of her, the woman was one and the same. She had inhabited that body for nearly a century. Vance found further corroboration in a letter from Dr. Thorne to a colleague at the Medical College of Georgia, filed erroneously in the tax box. Thorne, clearly disturbed by his patient, wrote, "I have treated the Thurman servant today. I recall treating a woman of identical appearance and bearing when I was a boy apprenticing with my father in 1850. She has not aged a day in 40 years, John. The flesh does not slacken. The eyes are covered in cataracts, yet she sees with perfect clarity. I felt a coldness radiating from the wound that numbed my fingers." This medical testimony introduced a new hypothesis, one that Vance hesitated to articulate even to herself. If the woman was biologically continuous, then her aging process had been arrested or altered by an unknown pathology. Thorne's letter speculated on unclassified glandular conditions or traits of the African constitution unknown to modern science, attempting to cloak his fear in medical jargon. But the subtext was clear. He had looked into the face of something that violated the natural order. The sources also revealed that the community had formed its own hypothesis, far removed from medical science. A collection of oral histories collected by a local folklore society in the 1920s, transcripts of which ended up in the box, spoke of the Thurmond haunt. Elderly residents interviewed in the transcripts claimed that Hannah was not a woman at all, but a haint or a judgment sent by God. One transcript read, "That woman ain't live 'cause she want to. She live 'cause she got work. She waiting for the last drop of blood. Once the blood gone, she go." This karmic hypothesis, that Hannah's life was functionally tied to the existence of the Thurmond line, explained the pattern of the deaths better than any medical theory. She was not living for the sake of life, she was living for the sake of the witness. The scar was her brand of ownership, but over the century, the meaning of the brand had shifted. It no longer marked her as their property, it marked them as her assignment. Vance's notes from this section of the archive show a shift in her own handwriting, becoming more jagged and pressed. The 1888 invoice and the star-shaped scar were the turning point where the investigation ceased to be about clerical errors and became a confrontation with the impossible. The science that refuses to study was exemplified by Dr. Thorne, who, after writing his disturbed letter, never published a paper on the woman, choosing instead to bury his observations in private correspondence. The evidence was irrefutable, but the implications were too terrifying to publicize. By the 1890s, the presence of Hannah had begun to fracture the social fabric of the Thurmond household and the surrounding community. The third master, Elias Thurmond, was presiding over the ruin of his family's legacy. The cotton fields lay fallow, the great house was peeling and grey, and the family's wealth had evaporated. But the true rot was inside the walls. A series of diaries kept by Elias's wife, Sarah Thurmond, provided a harrowing day-by-day account of a domestic existence ruled by terror. These diaries, bound in mildewed leather, documented the psychological disintegration of the slaveholding class when confronted with the enduring face of their sin. Sarah's entries from 1892 described a household in a state of siege. "Elias cannot sleep," she wrote. "He paces the floor, claiming that he hears her breathing in the hallway. We have fired the cook and the maid, unable to pay them, but Hannah remains. We do not pay her, we do not feed her, yet she appears every morning in the kitchen, boiling water, setting the table for a family that is vanishing. Elias screamed at her yesterday, ordered her to leave, to die, to go to the devil. She simply wiped the table and poured his coffee." The social fracture extended beyond the house. The town of Lexington, Georgia, began to shun the Thurmond family. Church records from the period showed that the Thurmonds were asked not to attend Sunday services. A letter from the church deacon to Elias stated, "The presence of your servant, that ancient woman who follows your carriage, unsettles the congregation. It is said she brings a chill that wilts the altar flowers. For the sake of the flock we ask that you pray at home." Hannah had become a pariah, not because of her race or station, but because she was a living memento mori, a walking reminder of death that the town wished to ignore. Sarah's diary entries grew increasingly erratic as the isolation deepened. She began to refer to Hannah as the kitchen witch or the white head wrap. One particularly disturbing entry read, "She owns the house more than we do. We are the ghosts haunting her halls. I woke last night to find her standing over Elias, just watching him breathe. She wasn't doing anything, just counting the breaths remaining. Elias says she is sucking the years out of him to add to her own. He looks 60, though he is but 45. This psychological horror, the belief that the servant was metabolizing the master's life force, marked the complete collapse of the master's authority. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had dissolved. Elias was technically the owner of the property, but he was a prisoner in his own home, held captive by a relic of his grandfather's era. The community's whispers turned into open hostility. A local newspaper editorial from 1893 vaguely referenced unnatural conditions at the old Thurmond place and called for a civic intervention to cleanse the county of lingering shadows. The fracture was also evident in the behavior of the children. Elias and Sarah's son, Julian, the last heir, grew up in this atmosphere of dread. School reports found in the box described Julian as morbid and prone to fits of shaking. A teacher's note explained, "The boy claims there's a woman at home who has no face, only eyes. He says she was there before his father was born and will be there after he is dead." The trauma of living with the anomaly was poisoning the next generation, ensuring that the curse would continue until the line was extinguished. In the winter of 1893, Sarah Thurmond fled the estate, unable to bear the pressure. Her farewell note to Elias, preserved in the diary, was a testament to the absolute breaking point of the human psyche. "I cannot stay and watch you fade while she stays full," Sarah wrote. "She is not human, Elias. She is the bill coming due. I'm leaving before she decides to count me too." Sarah's departure left Elias alone with Julian and Hannah, sealing the house's fate. The record of a social fracture showed that the horror of Hannah was not active violence. She never raised a hand, never poisoned a meal, never spoke a threat. Her weapon was her persistence. She broke the family by simply refusing to leave, by refusing to die, by serving them with a loyalty that had mutated into a curse. The documents captured the terrifying reality of a macabre mystery, where the punishment was simply the inability to escape the past. By 1894, the isolation was total. The Thurmond estate was a black hole in the social map of the county, a place avoided by travelers and neighbors alike. Inside, the documents suggest a quiet, suffocating routine. A dying man, a traumatized boy, and an immortal woman moving through the dust, waiting for the inevitable end of the chapter. The tension that had simmered for decades boiled over into the public record in May 1894, with the death of Elias Thurmond. His passing was not a private affair, but a public spectacle that produced the most damning piece of visual evidence in the entire case file. A clipping from the Oglethorpe Echo, the local newspaper, featured a grainy lithograph photograph of Elias's funeral procession. The image was meant to chronicle the passing of a prominent citizen, but the photographer had inadvertently captured something far more significant. In the background of the photo, standing well apart from the handful of mourners, stood a solitary figure wrapped in white. The caption, written by an editor who clearly struggled with how to identify her, read, "The funeral was attended by the deceased son, Julian, and the faithful family servant, Hannah, age unknown, present at her third master's passing." The phrase, "third master's passing," was printed in black and white, a public acknowledgement of her impossible tenure. The visual evidence was stark. While the white mourners bowed their heads in grief, the figure of Hannah stood upright, her face turned toward the coffin with an expression of cold, clinical observation. The impact of this photograph on the community was immediate and documented. Letters to the editor in the following weeks expressed a mixture of awe and revulsion. One reader wrote, "It is an abomination that this woman walks the earth. My grandfather spoke of her when he was a boy. She is a bad omen, a haint that should be put to rest." The town began to view her not as a loyal servant, but as a harbinger of doom. The photograph had transformed her from a private rumor into a public monster, a story so terrifying that parents used her name to frighten children. Following the funeral, the county records show a spike in suspicious activity reports centered around the Thurmond estate. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows at all hours, though the electricity had been cut off for non-payment. A sheriff's deputy report from late 1894 described an attempted welfare check on the young heir, Julian. "Found the boy Julian in a state of intoxication," the deputy wrote. "The old woman was sitting in the parlor, staring at the wall. When I addressed her, she recited the names of the previous sheriffs of this county, going back to 1820. She knew them all. I left immediately. The air in that house is not right." The irrefutable evidence extended to the financial collapse of the estate. The 1895 tax assessment listed the property value as plummeting, claiming the land was blighted. Yet, Hannah's presence remained the only stable asset. The irony was profound. The land was worthless, the house was rotting, the master was dead, but the slave remained valued. The town's refusal to intervene, documented in the minutes of a town council meeting, cited spiritual concerns as the reason for leaving the boy and the woman alone. They were quarantining the anomaly. This period also produced a chilling artifact, a ledger of deaths and births kept by the local undertaker. Next to the entry for Elias Thurmond, the undertaker had scrawled a note in pencil, likely never meant to be seen. Body appeared drained of blood, though no wound present, like a husk. The woman watched me prepare him. She pointed to the empty coffin and said, "One more." I believe she meant the boy. This testimony from the man responsible for dealing with the dead confirmed the parasitic nature of the relationship. She was counting down the lineage. The irrefutable evidence block solidified the narrative that Hannah was an active agent of history, not a passive victim. The photograph of her at the funeral served as proof that she was the constant variable in the equation of the Thurmond demise. She was the anchor that held them to their fate. The community's reaction, fear, avoidance, and superstition, was a collective admission that they recognized the supernatural justice at play, even if they couldn't name it. By the turn of the century, Hannah had become a local legend, the woman who would not die. Oh, but the documents revealed that her survival was not a miracle. It was a sentence. She was sentenced to watch, and the Thurmans were sentenced to be watched. The photograph from 1894 remained the visual anchor of this truth, a blurry image of a woman in white, standing on the edge of the grave, waiting for the final scoop of dirt so she could turn her attention to the last victim. The first decade of the 20th century marked the final agonizing collapse of the Thurman Authority, a process meticulously detailed in the sterile columns of the 1910 U.S. Census. The census taker, a man named Robert E. Lee Smith, arrived at the dilapidated plantation house to find a scene of Gothic ruin. His official log, preserved in the archives, listed the household members with a trembling hand that betrayed his unease. Head of household, Julian Thurmond, age 40, occupation, none. Second member, Hannah, age listed as unknown 100 plus, relationship to head servant. In the margins of the census log, Smith violated protocol to add a personal observation. Subject Julian was incoherent, smelling of corn liquor. House is devoid of furniture, roof collapsing. The colored woman sat in the chair opposite him. She answered the questions he could not. She claimed to remember the Revolutionary War, claimed she is waiting for him to die. I feared for my safety and departed. This official government record captured the complete inversion of the power dynamic. The master was a broken, drunken invalid. The slave was the lucid, dominant authority in the home. Julian Thurman's decline was documented in a series of legal notices and debt collections found in the box. He had sold off the last of the family silver, the farming equipment, and even the family Bible. He was drinking himself to death, trapped in the house with the living memory of his ancestors' sins. A letter from Julian to a distant cousin in Atlanta, never mailed, read like a confession from purgatory. "She won't let me leave," he scrawled. "I tried to walk to the road, but she stood on the porch and looked at me, and my legs turned to water. She is keeping me here until I rot. She is the jailer, cousin. We thought we owned them, but she owns us." The collapse was physical as well as social. The county health inspector visited the property in 1911 and condemned the well water. His report noted, "The conditions are unfit for habitation. Filth abounds, yet the old woman appears clean, her clothes laundered and white. How she maintains this amidst the squalor is beyond explanation." Hannah's purity in the midst of the rot was a recurring theme. She was immune to the degradation that consumed everything else. She was the pristine white cloth wrapped around the festering wound of the legacy. The final authority to collapse was the illusion of Julian's free will. A grocer's ledger from the town general store showed that Julian stopped coming to town in late 1911. Instead, he sent notes written in a shaky hand, asking for whiskey to be left at the gate. The delivery boy reported to the sheriff that the old woman collects the bottles. She pays with old coins, Spanish silver and gold pieces from before the war. She looks at me and I forget my own name. Hannah was funding his destruction with the hoard of the ancestors, facilitating the end of the line with the very wealth they had extracted from her labor. On a stormy night in March 1912, the inevitable occurred. The coroner's report for Julian Thurmond described a liver failure induced by acute alcohol poisoning. But the scene description was the true horror. Julian was found dead in the parlor, sitting in a rotting armchair. Opposite him, in a matching chair, sat Hannah, her hands folded in her lap, watching the corpse. She had not summoned help. She had not moved. She had simply waited for the cessation of life. The coroner noted, "The woman seemed satisfied. She asked if there were any more Thurmans. When I told her he was the last, she closed her eyes and finally exhaled, as if holding her breath for a century." With Julian's death, the legal entity of the Thurmond estate ceased to exist. The land was seized by the bank, the house slated for demolition, but the question remained: what to do with the property that had outlasted the owners? Hannah was technically free, but she was also a ward of a history that no one wanted to claim. The collapse of the Thurmond Authority left her as a singular, terrifying artifact, a woman without a master, standing in the ruins of the world she had watched die. The authorities, baffled and frightened, made the decision to move her to the Coloured Infirmary in the county seat. The transfer order, signed by the sheriff, read like the transport of hazardous material rather than a patient. "Handle with care," it advised. "Do not look her in the eye. Do not ask her questions. She is the last of them." The collapse was complete. The dynasty was dead, and the witness was being moved to a holding cell. Her testimony concluded. Ilara Vance believed she had reached the end of the narrative with the death of Julian, but the box in the 1932 archive held one final, hidden secret. Tucked inside the folded lining of a tax folder was a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages brittle and yellow. It was the personal journal of Dr. Arthur Evans, a visiting physician from Philadelphia who had toured southern infirmaries in 1913 as part of a philanthropic medical mission. His journal entry, dated April 14, 1913, documented his encounter with Hannah in the segregated ward of the Oglethorpe Infirmary. Evans was an outsider, a man of northern science unburdened by the local superstitions, which made his observations all the more chilling. "I was introduced to a patient known only as Hannah," Evans wrote. "The local staff refuses to enter her room, leaving trays of food at the door. They claim she is a witch. I found a small, frail woman of immense dignity sitting by the window. When I asked her age, she did not give me a number. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to contain a cataract of history and began to speak." What followed in the journal was a transcription of Hannah's voice, the only direct record of her words in existence. Dr. Evans wrote, "She did not speak of her pains or her needs. Instead, she began to recite a list. She recited the full name, birth date and death date of Silas Thurmond, then Jebediah, then Elias, then Julian. She recited the names of their wives, their stillborn children, their horses and their dogs. She recited the dates of the planting and the harvest for every year since 1790. She spoke not as a storyteller, but as an accountant reading a ledger. It was a recitation of the dead, delivered in perfect chronological order." Evans noted his own physiological reaction to the recitation. "As she spoke, I felt a heaviness in the room, as if the air were becoming solid. She told me, 'I was told to keep the count. The count is done. The books are closed.' I asked her who told her to keep the count. She smiled, a gesture that lacked all mirth, and pointed to the scar on her neck. 'The first one,' she said. 'He bought a memory, not a slave. Now he is the memory, and I am the book.' This hidden source revealed the true nature of the anomaly. Hannah was not merely a passive observer, she was a living vessel of record. The scar, the silence, the longevity, it was all functional. She had been engineered, by trauma or by fate, to serve as the external hard drive for a family that was destined to destroy itself. Dr. Evans's analysis went further. "I believe this woman is kept alive by the sheer force of obligation. Now that the subjects of her obligation are gone, I suspect she will not linger. She is a biological impossibility sustained by a moral necessity." The journal also contained a sketch Evans had made of Hannah. It showed the star-shaped scar in detail, noting its keloid formation. Beneath the sketch, Evans wrote, "She refused my offer of a physical examination. She said, 'There is nothing to fix. The machine stops when the work is done.' I have never felt so small in the presence of a patient. She is not of this time." Vance realized that this journal was the key to understanding the hidden motive. Hannah hadn't just survived, she had executed a sentence. The recitation was the proof that nothing had been lost, that every cruelty and every luxury of the Thurmond line had been recorded in the mind of the woman they deemed property. Dr. Evans's journal ended with a note of profound unease. "I leave Georgia tomorrow. I will not mention this case in my official report. Who would believe that a slave outlived the master's entire bloodline out of sheer spiteful duty? It is a medical curiosity, yes, but it is primarily a spiritual catastrophe." The discovery of this hidden source shifted the narrative from horror to tragedy. Hannah was not a monster. She was a martyr of memory. She had carried the burden of the truth for 132 years, holding it inside her body until the last of the perpetrators was in the ground. Now, in the sterile room of the infirmary, she was finally laying the burden down. The final years of Hannah's life, from 1914 to 1918, were documented in the clinical charts of the Oglethorpe Infirmary. These charts, usually dry and repetitive, told a story of a deliberate, methodical shutdown. The decision for decisive action did not come from the doctors, but from the patient herself. The charts recorded a consistent refusal of sustenance. Patient refuses tray. Patient refuses water. Patient refuses medication. Yet, defying medical logic, the starvation did not kill her in weeks. She faded over the course of 4 years, a slow, controlled dimming of the light. The head nurse, a woman named Beatrice Holt, wrote a series of incident reports regarding Hannah's room. "The other patients are afraid of room 4, she wrote. "They say they hear voices coming from it at night, many voices arguing and crying. But when I check, Hannah is alone, sleeping. It is as if she is releasing the ghosts she has carried one by one." This purging process was the final act of her long life. She was emptying the books she had told Dr. Evans about. The infirmary administration, unsure of what to do with a patient who wouldn't eat but wouldn't die, debated transferring her to the state asylum. A letter from the hospital administrator justified the proposed transfer. "The woman is a disturbance to the natural order. She sits by the window and watches the road. She is waiting for something that has not arrived. Her longevity is unnatural and provokes superstition among the staff. We must remove her." But the transfer never happened. The staff was too afraid to move her, fearing that touching her would transfer the curse. The records show that Hannah's condition stabilized in a state of impossible suspension. She became a fixture of the infirmary, a living statue, as one nurse described her. She ceased to speak entirely after 1915. Her silence was not passive, it was an active barrier. She had said all she needed to say to Dr. Evans. Now she was engaging in the final accounting, balancing the internal ledger before closing the account for good. In 1917, a young orderly attempted to force-feed Hannah, believing he was saving her. The incident report described the outcome. Orderly Smith attempted to administer broth. Patient looked at him. Orderly dropped the bowl and fled. He claims he saw his own death in her eyes. He has resigned. This incident reinforced the boundary. Hannah determined the terms of her existence, and she would determine the terms of her end. The decision for decisive action was Hannah's choice to die. The sources justified this not as suicide, but as the completion of a contract. The Thurmond line was extinguished. The debt was paid. There was no reason to continue the impossible biological effort of survival. She was unanchoring herself from the world. The documents describe a woman who was shedding her immortality like an old coat, preparing to walk into the darkness as a free agent for the first time in a century and a half. By late 1918, the charts noted that her pulse was slowing to a rate that should have been comatose, yet she remained conscious. Heart rate 30 beats per minute, the chart read. Eyes open, alert. She was timing her departure. The world outside was embroiled in the Great War, a global slaughter that mirrored the domestic slaughter she had witnessed. As the world approached the armistice, Hannah approached her own peace. The tension in the infirmary grew as the staff realized they were witnessing a death that was being choreographed. They stopped trying to intervene. They simply watched, becoming the secondary witnesses to the primary witness. The room became a chapel of silence, where the only sound was the impossibly slow rhythm of a heart that had beaten since the presidency of George Washington. The climax of the documentation is the death certificate of Hannah, dated November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day. The synchronicity of the date is striking, as the guns fell silent across Europe, ending the war to end all wars. The war within Hannah finally ceased. The certificate is a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. The attending physician, unable to diagnose a disease in a body that simply stopped, wrote in the space for cause of death, senility, exhaustion. But then, in a heavy ink stroke, he crossed those out and wrote a phrase that has no place in medical terminology, cessation of necessity. The certificate listed her estimated age as 132. It is the only official government document that acknowledges the impossibility. Beside the certificate, Ilara Vance found a nurse's note describing the moment of passing. At the 11th hour, the note read, the patient turned her head from the window. She looked at the empty chair beside her bed, smiled as if greeting an old friend, and closed her eyes. The room felt instantly lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from the roof. The clock on the wall stopped. This final primary source was the seal on the file. Cessation of necessity was the ultimate interpretation of her life. She lived because it was necessary to witness the justice. She died because the justice was complete. The interpretation of the smile was equally profound. Was she greeting freedom, or was she greeting the last of the Thurmans, finally coming to collect him to hell? The ambiguity was the final note of the mystery. The archives also contained a receipt for a pauper's burial in the colored section of the local cemetery. The cost was 2 bonzuros. No headstone was purchased. The disparity between her value in 1850, 900, and her value at death, 2, highlighted the tragedy of her existence in the eyes of the state. She was priceless when she was property. She was worthless when she was free. Vance held the death certificate in her hand in 1932, feeling the texture of the paper. She realized that this single sheet of paper was the victory. Hannah had won. She had outlasted the whip, the chains, the war, the hunger, and the men who thought they owned her. She had died on her own terms, on a day of peace, leaving behind a record that proved the impermanence of power and the permanence of memory. The final source was not just a record of death, it was a certificate of completion. The assignment was finished. The anomaly was resolved. The impossible mystery was solved, not by science, but by the simple passage of time. Hannah had walked the long road, and at the end of it, she had found the exit. In the solitude of the basement, Ilara Vance faced a moral dilemma that would define the legacy of the case. She had uncovered a story that rewrote the history of the county, a story of supernatural endurance and retributive justice, but she also understood the world she lived in. It was 1932, Georgia. If she published the Thurmond anomaly, it would be dismissed as Negro superstition or sensationalized as a freak show. The dignity of Hannah's vigil would be stripped away. The white establishment would not accept a narrative where a slave defeated the masters through sheer spiritual superiority. Vance's decision is recorded in her own field journal, the final document in the box. "I cannot file this report," she wrote. To give this story to the state is to give Hannah back to the Thurmans. They owned her body for a century. They will not own her legend. This truth belongs to the silence. Vance made the decision to bury the file. She did not catalogue the Thurman box. She mislabeled it, taping it shut with the wax seal she had found, and shoved it behind a wall of water-damaged tax assessments. Her action was an act of protection. She was the final guardian of the secret. She stole only one item, the 1914 photograph. The loss of the photograph from the official archive meant that Hannah's face would never be gawked at by the curious or the cruel. Vance took the image home, placing it on her own mantle, bringing Hannah into a home where she would be honored, not feared. The consequences of the Thurmond anomaly lingered in the county, however. Local folklore speaks of the Thurmond curse, warning that anyone who buys the old land suffers misfortune. The land lay fallow for decades, eventually reclaimed by the forest. The legacy of Hannah was a scar on the geography of the county, a place where nothing would grow because the soil had been judged and found wanting. The documents Vance hid remained in the darkness, rotting slowly. The documented consequences were silence and erasure. But in erasing the story, Vance preserved its power. It became a whisper, a rumor, a macabre mystery that could never be disproven because the evidence was hidden. Hannah became a myth, and myths are harder to kill than people. In 1936, 4 years after Ilara Vance's discovery, a mysterious fire swept through the basement of the Oglethorpe County Courthouse. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but the fire was localized to the section housing the liquidated assets of the antebellum estates. The box labeled Thurmond was reduced to ash. The evidence of the 132-year-old witness was destroyed, fulfilling Vance's desire to protect the truth from the state. However, history has a way of resurfacing. In 2015, a team of university archaeologists conducting a ground-penetrating radar survey of the historic segregated cemetery in Lexington found an anomaly. In the sector recorded as the pauper's grave for Hannah, no surname, the radar showed nothing. The earth was undisturbed. There was no coffin, no bones, no buttons, no dust. The grave was empty. This final discovery reopens the question that science refused to answer. Did Hannah truly die in 1918? Or upon the cessation of necessity, did she simply cease to exist, dissolving back into the timeline she had inhabited for so long? Or more terrifyingly, did she walk away? Is the impossible mystery that she lived to 132? Or is it that she never truly died at all? Perhaps she is still out there, wrapped in white, standing in the shadows of a new dynasty, keeping the count, waiting for a new debt to come due. The empty grave suggests that some burdens are too heavy to be buried. They just keep walking. What do you think? Was Hannah a biological anomaly, a spiritual judgment, or something else entirely? And why was her grave found empty? If you believe that history is full of secrets that refuse to stay buried, subscribe to Before the Story. Click the bell icon so you never miss a revelation. Leave a comment below with your theory. Did she die or did she leave?